back when I was in high school, being called a nerd wasn't the harmless joke it seems to be today. These days, people wear the label almost like a badge of honor. In the early 2000s, at least where I grew up, it was different. My friends and I were the kids who spent lunch talking about books, movies, and whatever strange hobby had captured our attention that week. We cared about our grades. We listened to music that wasn't considered cool. We didn't play sports, and we certainly weren't part of the popular crowd. Because of that, we were easy targets. The teasing was constant. Most days it was just insults shouted across the hallway or snide comments muttered under someone's breath. Other times it got physical. Getting shoved into lockers wasn't uncommon. Once one of my friends had his backpack thrown onto the roof of the gym. Looking back, it sounds ridiculous, but at the time it felt like survival. Every day was about keeping your head down and making it to the final bell. Junior year was the worst year of all. That was when Tyler seemed to make it his personal mission to make our lives miserable. Tyler was one of those people who thrived on attention. If there was an audience, he needed to be at the center of it. He wasn't particularly smart, but he was confident in a way that made other students follow him. He loved humiliating people, especially anyone he thought was weaker than him. If we were walking through the parking lot, he'd yell something. If we were sitting at lunch, he'd stop by our table just to make fun of us. Sometimes he'd bump into us accidentally in the hallways hard enough to knock books out of our hands. Teachers rarely saw it happen, and when they did, Tyler always had an excuse. By the time spring arrived, almost everyone was counting down the days until summer vacation. That's when Tyler came up with what he thought would be his greatest achievement. He decided he was going to break into St. Edmund Academy after hours and pull off the biggest prank the school had ever seen. St. Edmund wasn't an ordinary school. The building itself was over a century old. Its stone walls, narrow hallways, and towering windows made it look more like a monastery than a school. During the day, it felt strict and imposing. At night, according to generations of students, it felt haunted. The stories had been around for as long as anyone could remember. Before becoming a school, the property had supposedly served as a hospital decades earlier. Some versions of the story claimed it had been used during disease outbreaks. Others insisted injured soldiers had once been treated there. Every graduating class seemed to add a few new details to the legend. The most popular story involved underground tunnels. Students whispered that bodies had once been transported through hidden passageways beneath the building. Some claimed maintenance workers had discovered sealed-off sections under the basement. Others swore they had heard voices coming from beneath the floors after dark. Nobody ever had proof. Still, the rumors never died. By junior year, those stories had become part of the school's identity. Tyler knew all about them. That was exactly why he chose St. Edmund for his stunt. According to what eventually came out, he snuck into the building one weekend night with a few friends acting as lookouts. He trashed several classrooms, dumped stacks of papers onto the floors, overturned chairs, and covered rows of lockers with red paint. To make things even worse, he wrote fake messages meant to look supernatural. Some lockers had phrases like, "We are still here." Others simply said, "Help US." The next Monday, students walked into what looked like a scene from a horror movie. Teachers were furious. Students were fascinated. The whole school spent days talking about it. Then Tyler added one final detail to the story. While he had been down in the basement, he claimed he heard voices coming from beneath the floor. He said he saw moving shadows that didn't belong to anyone. According to him, something had followed him through the darkness. He told everyone he had barely escaped. Most people believed him. In fact, some students treated him like a hero. My friends and I thought the whole thing was nonsense. Tyler lied constantly. Why would this be any different? So, during the final week of school, we decided to find out for ourselves. It started as a joke. Then, somehow, it became a plan. My friend Dylan's mother worked as a janitor at St. Edmund. One afternoon, Dylan mentioned that he could probably borrow a spare key. The moment he said it, everyone went quiet. A few seconds later, we were discussing dates and times. Looking back now, it was an incredibly stupid idea. At 17, it sounded like an adventure. The last day of school arrived. That evening, after dinner, I told my parents I was spending the night at a friend's house. They barely questioned it. Summer vacation had officially started and everyone was relaxed. Around 10 o'clock, the four of us met in the parking lot behind the school. The building stood dark against the night sky. Without students, teachers, and noise, it felt strangely lifeless. Dylan unlocked a side entrance, and we slipped inside. The door clicked shut behind us. For a moment, none of us spoke. Schools make noise during the day. You never notice it until it's gone. At night, every sound feels amplified. The hum of distant ventilation systems, the creak of old pipes, the faint groan of settling wood. Even our footsteps sounded too loud. We made our way through familiar hallways that suddenly seemed unfamiliar. The trophy cases reflected our flashlight beams. Rows of lockers stretched into darkness. Classroom doors sat closed like silent observers. Eventually, we reached the basement. The heavy door opened with a long metallic groan. The smell hit us immediately. Dust, old paper, damp concrete. The basement was enormous. Stacks of outdated textbooks filled entire corners. Broken desks leaned against walls. Boxes of holiday decorations sat forgotten beneath plastic sheets. It looked less like part of a school and more like a warehouse where decades of memories had been abandoned. Then there were the statues. A row of old religious figures stood against one wall. Dust covered their faces. Their glass eyes reflected our flashlight beams. Something about them made my skin crawl. No matter where I stood, it felt like they were watching us. We spent nearly 30 minutes wandering through the basement. At first, it was exciting. Then it became boring. There were no ghosts, no mysterious voices, no hidden monsters, just old junk. I was already thinking about heading home when Dylan called out. "Guys, come look at this." We followed his voice. Behind several stacked boxes, partially hidden from view, was a small opening in the wall. It was easy to miss. The hole was only large enough for someone to crawl through. Dylan moved a few boxes aside and shined his flashlight inside. The beam disappeared into darkness. "That's definitely a tunnel," he said. Nobody disagreed. The tunnel looked old, very old. The walls appeared to be rough stone, and the passage seemed to continue far beyond what our flashlights could reveal. For a moment, nobody volunteered to go first. Then someone suggested drawing straws. A terrible idea. An idea we immediately accepted. A few minutes later, I was staring at the shortest straw. Everyone laughed. I didn't. "Have fun," Dylan said. I muttered something that probably wasn't polite and dropped onto my hands and knees. The opening was tight. Dust coated my clothes almost immediately. The air felt cooler inside, and somehow quieter. I crawled forward. The flashlight beam bounced against rough stone walls. The further I moved, the more isolated I felt from my friends. At first, I could still hear them talking. Then their voices became distant. Then they disappeared completely. I stopped for a moment. That's when I heard it, a faint rushing sound. At first, I thought it might be water, maybe air moving through old pipes. But as I listened, the sound seemed to change. It almost sounded like whispering. Not words, just soft overlapping sounds. The kind your brain tries desperately to interpret. I swallowed hard. "Guys?" I called. No response. I tried again. Nothing. The tunnel suddenly felt much smaller. I kept moving. A few feet later, my flashlight landed on something that instantly froze every muscle in my body. Someone was there, a person, crouched in the darkness watching me. For a second, my mind refused to process what I was seeing. The figure was painfully thin. His clothes hung loosely from his body. His skin looked dirty and pale. Dark circles surrounded sunken eyes. I could see ribs beneath his shirt. He looked like someone who hadn't had a decent meal in weeks, maybe months. He stared back. Neither of us moved. Every scary story I had ever heard vanished from my mind. The reality was somehow worse. Because this wasn't a ghost, this was a real person, a stranger, living inside a tunnel beneath my school. My voice shook as I spoke. Are you okay?" No answer. The figure remained perfectly still. For a moment, I wondered if he was injured, or sick, or simply terrified. Then everything changed. Without warning, he lunged forward. The movement was so sudden that I barely had time to react. As he rushed toward me, he made a sound unlike anything I had ever heard before. It wasn't a scream. It wasn't a shout. It sounded almost animal-like. Raw, desperate, wild. Pure panic exploded through my body. I scrambled backward as fast as I could. My flashlight slipped from my hand and slammed against the tunnel floor. I barely managed to grab it before continuing to crawl. Stones scraped my elbows. Dust filled my mouth. All I cared about was getting out. The opening ahead finally appeared. I practically launched myself through it. The moment I burst back into the basement, my friends knew something was wrong. I must have looked terrified. Before I could even speak, the figure emerged from the tunnel behind me. My friends saw him too. Every ounce of skepticism disappeared from their faces. The man crawled out of the opening and slowly stood. He looked even worse under the flashlight beams. Filthy, exhausted, unsteady. For one brief second, he stretched a hand toward us. That was enough. We ran. Nobody waited. Nobody tried to be brave. We sprinted across the basement, up the stairs, through the hallways and out the side entrance. The entire time I expected to feel someone grabbing my shoulder. I expected footsteps behind us. I expected that horrible sound again, but none of it happened. We didn't stop running until we reached the parking lot. Then we kept going. Years have passed since that night. I've replayed it in my mind countless times. I don't believe we encountered anything supernatural. The most likely explanation is also the simplest one. The tunnel probably connected to another part of the property, and somehow a homeless man had found shelter there. Maybe he had been living underground for months, maybe longer. There are plenty of logical explanations. Yet even now, after all these years, one memory refuses to fade. His eyes. I can still see them. Not because they looked evil, not because they looked supernatural, but because they looked completely broken. There was a loneliness in them that I've never forgotten. For a brief moment, before he charged toward me, I remember seeing fear in those eyes, and sometimes I wonder whether he was just as terrified of us as we were of him. The girl in the gold mask. A few years after the incident beneath St. Edmund Academy, I finished my first year of college and came home for the summer. Like a lot of college freshmen, I spent that year trying to figure out who I was supposed to become. College had been exciting, but it had also been exhausting. I was living away from home for the first time, juggling classes, working part-time when I could, and trying to build a social life from scratch. Some friendships lasted. Others disappeared almost as quickly as they began. Relationships were even more complicated. By the time summer arrived, I was looking forward to something simple. No exams, no deadlines, no stress. Just a few months of sleeping in, hanging out with old friends, and enjoying the feeling of being home again. About 2 weeks after I got back, my friend Mason announced he was throwing a party. His parents were going out of town for the weekend, and Mason had somehow convinced himself that nothing could possibly go wrong. Anyone who knew Mason understood that was usually a bad sign. The moment the invitation started circulating, half the town seemed interested. At first it was supposed to be a small gathering. Then someone suggested inviting more people. Then someone else suggested turning it into a costume party. Within days, the guest list had doubled. By the time the night arrived, it felt less like a house party and more like a community event. Cars lined both sides of the road. Music echoed through the neighborhood. People were arriving faster than anyone could keep track of them. Most of the costumes looked like they had been assembled 15 minutes before leaving the house. There were fake vampires, superheroes, pirates, and more hockey masks than I could count. I ended up wearing an old hockey mask I found in my parents' garage. It smelled faintly like dust and mildew. I looked ridiculous, which was perfect. Nobody was taking the costume seriously anyway. The atmosphere felt lighthearted. People laughed. Music blasted from giant speakers. Groups gathered around the backyard fire pit, telling stories and sharing drinks. For the first few hours, it was exactly the kind of carefree summer night most people remember fondly years later. Then I noticed her. At first, it was only a brief glimpse. I happened to look toward the house while standing near the patio. Inside, behind a sliding glass door, a girl stood alone. Unlike everyone else, her costume looked deliberate, elegant, almost theatrical. She wore a gold masquerade mask that covered the upper half of her face. The metallic surface reflected the lights from inside the house. Even from a distance, it caught my attention immediately. What struck me wasn't the mask itself. It was the way she was looking at me, not glancing, not casually observing, watching. When our eyes met, she didn't look away. Instead, she raised her hand and gave a small wave. I smiled and waved back. A second later, she disappeared into the crowd. I assumed that was the end of it. At a party that crowded, people constantly appeared and vanished. Still, I found myself looking for her again, not obsessively. Just enough to notice she wasn't around. An hour passed, maybe 2. I talked with friends, grabbed another drink, listened to terrible attempts at karaoke, and tried not to think about the mysterious girl in the gold mask. Then I saw her again. This time she was standing near the edge of the backyard. Beyond her was the tree line, a dark wall of woods separating the property from several acres of undeveloped land. The moment she noticed me looking, she turned and began walking toward the trees. Then she looked back and waved, not a casual greeting, a beckoning gesture, a clear invitation. Follow me. Looking back now, I realize how unbelievably stupid my next decision was. At the time, it felt exciting. I was 19. A pretty girl appeared interested in me. That was all the reasoning I needed. I started walking toward the woods. The sounds of the party followed me at first. Music, laughter, conversations. The farther I went, the more distant everything became. The grass beneath my shoes gave way to dirt and fallen leaves. Tree branches blocked the glow from the backyard lights. The darkness deepened around me. Every few seconds I thought I caught sight of her moving between the trees. A glimpse of dark hair, a flash of pale skin. Then nothing. I kept following. Soon the party felt very far away. The music had faded into little more than a faint vibration in the distance. The woods seemed unnaturally quiet, no voices, no laughter, just the occasional rustle of leaves. I stopped walking. Suddenly, the whole situation felt strange. "Hello?" I called. No answer. For a moment, I considered turning around. Then I heard her voice, soft, playful, almost teasing. "Don't go back yet." The voice came from somewhere ahead. "Come find me." I smiled. Me felt nervous. Another part felt intrigued. The mystery was working exactly as intended. I continued deeper into the trees. The ground became uneven. Roots pushed through the soil like hidden traps. Several times I nearly lost my footing. Then my flashlight from my phone caught something reflective lying on the ground. I bent down and picked it up, the gold mask. It was hers. There was no doubt about it. The metallic surface gleamed beneath the moonlight filtering through the branches. For some reason, finding the mask made the situation feel even stranger. Why would she leave it behind? Was it intentional? An accident? I looked around. Nothing. Only darkness. Then I heard movement ahead. When I raised my head, I saw her. She stood several yards away, motionless, waiting. Long dark hair covered part of her face. She wore a white tank top and black shorts. Without the mask, she looked more familiar, but I couldn't immediately place her. I walked toward her, trying to appear confident, trying not to appear confused. As I got closer, I held up the mask. "I think this belongs to you." She smiled. At least I think she did. The darkness made it difficult to tell. I introduced myself. Before I could say much else, she spoke. "I know who you are." The words immediately changed everything. Something about her voice triggered a memory, just a feeling, a sense that I had heard it before. I took another step forward. The pieces began falling into place. College, parties, mutual friends, conversations I barely remembered. Then suddenly I recognized her. She was a friend of a girl I had briefly dated during my first semester. The relationship hadn't lasted long. A few dates, a few awkward conversations. Eventually we went our separate ways. At least that's how I saw it. Apparently someone else saw it differently. Before I could ask what she was doing there, I heard a loud crack from somewhere nearby, a branch snapping. Then another. My stomach dropped. The girl stepped backward, almost as if she knew what was coming. Then everything exploded into motion. A figure burst from the darkness beside me. At first I couldn't process what I was seeing. Then the moonlight hit her face, my ex-girlfriend. She was gripping a metal baseball bat, and she was running directly toward me. The first swing came so fast I barely reacted. The bat cut through the air where my head had been a fraction of a second earlier. Instinct took over. I threw myself sideways. The impact never came. Instead, I heard the bat strike a tree trunk with a metallic clang. For a brief moment, nobody moved. Then she screamed. Not words, just pure rage. The kind of anger that sounds almost inhuman. She yanked the bat free and swung again. This time I didn't wait. I turned and ran. Branches slapped against my face. Leaves crunched beneath my feet. Adrenaline surged through my body. Behind me, I could hear shouting. I didn't look back. Every instinct told me to keep moving. The woods that had seemed quiet and mysterious minutes earlier now felt like a maze. I stumbled over roots, nearly fell twice. At one point, I crashed through a bush so hard scratches covered my arms. None of it mattered. I only cared about reaching the house. The distant music grew louder. The lights became visible again through the trees. For the first time, I felt hope. I burst out of the woods and sprinted across the backyard. People turned to stare. Some laughed at first, assuming I was joking. Then they saw my face. I was yelling before I even reached the crowd. "Someone's out there. She's got a bat!" The party stopped almost immediately. Music was turned off. People started asking questions. Several guys grabbed flashlights and headed toward the tree line. Others called friends to make sure everyone was accounted for. Within minutes, the atmosphere had completely changed. The fun was gone. The carefree mood had evaporated. What remained was confusion and concern. The party ended shortly afterward. People left in groups. Nobody wanted to stay. I spent the rest of the night replaying everything that had happened. At first I was angry, then confused, then unsettled. The more I thought about it, the more disturbing it became. What if she hadn't missed? What if I had gone a little deeper into the woods? What exactly had they planned? The question stayed with me long after the bruises and scratches healed. For the rest of that summer, I constantly looked over my shoulder. Whenever I parked my car, I checked my mirrors. Whenever I walked alone at night, I paid attention to every sound. The experience had changed something, not dramatically, but enough to make me more cautious, enough to remind me that people can surprise you, sometimes in good ways, sometimes in terrifying ones. I never saw my ex-girlfriend again. As far as I know, she eventually moved away. Life continued. Years passed. But every now and then, I think about that night in the woods. I think about the gold mask, the strange game, the feeling of being lured farther and farther from safety without realizing it. Most of all, I think about a lesson that took me years to fully understand. Sometimes a relationship that seems brief and insignificant to one person can leave a much deeper wound in someone else. And sometimes the most frightening thing you encounter isn't a ghost hiding in the dark. It's another human being carrying anger you've never truly seen before.